Psychology Without Borders, Providing Hope and Healing in the Face of Adversity. That's a topic that covers a wide terrain. For my part, I'll be speaking about one cause of adversity. Let's see if I can do it this way. And that is conflict. I'll also touch on avoiding destructive conflict processes and outcomes, and ameliorating the impact of conflict, or helping folks heal through community and the crossing of borders. So these photos are somewhat disturbing, and I apologize for that, but they're a reality, and I'm sure not new to you. At its most destructive, one of the outcomes of conflict is war. Expensive in blood and treasure, and the wars that we see featured here are from left to right: Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Syria. And we can list with numbing certainty the outcomes of war: death, injury, emotional and physical trauma, destruction of property, dislocation of population, disruption of civil society, and the destruction of cultural treasure, just to name a few. And the seeds for future conflict that are sown by the win-lose nature of most armed conflict. Equally bloody and destructive, but at a more local domestic level, is youth or gang violence. Again, the outcomes include death, injury, emotional and physical trauma, destruction of property, and importantly, sowing the seeds of future violence that some social scientists have begun to think of in epidemiological or public health terms as a contagious disease. And finally, conflict within families. Outcomes here are no less sad, just less broad, and they include divorce, emotional trauma, the disruption of children's emotional development, stress, anxiety, and depression, to name a few. However, and fortunately, not all outcomes of conflict are destructive. Gandhi led millions of Indians in nonviolent protests to ouster British colonial rule, leading to self-determination. Mandela survived, of course, almost 30 years in prison and led to an end of apartheid. And Northern Ireland signed a peace treaty, not without its subsequent challenges. Here I'm touching on the outcomes, and throughout the talk I'll be focusing more on the conflict processes that lead to these outcomes, and that's where the research is most interesting and a little bit more nuanced. Not all outcomes of gang violence are necessarily destructive, or I should say that recently there have been a number of programs who have sought to intervene and stop that contagion of violence by interrupting the sowing of seeds leading to future conflict. There's an organization called Ceasefire in Chicago. Some of you may have seen the film The Interrupters, starring a woman named Amina Matthews, who's truly remarkable. And they use a unique, becoming less unique, fortunately, because it's working, but a original community police, former gang affiliates approach to interrupting the spread and continuation of violence. And finally, families. Families fight over money, sex, chores, priorities, and yet often resolve those conflicts without causing destruction. And more importantly, with learning and often coming up with more creative solutions than either party or actor alone could. We define conflict as a process that's triggered by the perception of opposing and or incompatible interests, goals, needs, etc., between two or more people. So because we're fast approaching April 15th, I thought I would use a family conflict around taxes as an example. My husband was determined that we should not file for an extension for our taxes this year. his arguments, hanging over our head, still have to estimate and pay funds, why do it twice? So sort of the closure and efficiency perspective. I, on the other hand, am living an academic lifestyle. I have a book chapter due shortly. I have a pile of journals to grade, and between now and graduation, I will be giving a couple of invited talks. In my view, why not buy a little time? Why is April 15th sacrosanct? Why create extra pressure that's unproductive? My need for stress reduction. And our incompatible needs cause conflict only because of our interdependency. If we file our taxes jointly. If we were filing separately and prepared them independently, there would not be conflict. So that interdependency, the fact that what your interests and the way you hope to achieve them are infringing or making or incompatible with my interests and needs. Also, it's important to note that conflict is inevitable. Of course, if our definition is opposing interests, hello, when isn't there conflict? But it doesn't mean that it's destructive, and that's one of the points I hope you'll walk away with today, that conflict just is, and what we do about it, how we handle it, the processes that we use can be constructive, leading to strengthening of relationship and more creative solutions, or destructive, leading to some of the terrible outcomes we looked at a moment ago, but also to damaging relationships and sowing the seeds for future conflict. And I'd now like to take a moment. I will both define what ICCCR stands for and honor our intellectual legacy, both mine as a proud associate director of the ICCCR, but all of ours in that Morton Deutsch, who founded the center some 27 years ago, has been part of TC's intellectual legacy for half a century. This theoretical framing of conflict in terms of constructive and destructive processes was developed by Deutsch in 1973. He is truly a pioneer and a giant in social psychology, particularly conflict resolution and social justice. And many of you, some of you, may have taken classes from him, read his books, heard him speak. He was a student of the legendary social psychologist Kurt Lewin at MIT, so we have a straight line between him and my colleague Peter Coleman, the director of the ICCCR. ICCCR stands for International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution. There are many centers around the country and around the world that focus on conflict analysis, conflict resolution. But because of Mort's insights into the importance of cooperation and the possibility for constructive outcomes, he named the center to include the term cooperation. Just a quick shout out to his incredible longevity and productivity. I mentioned that he joined a half century ago. He continues to be enormously productive. He comes into the office 4 days a week. Within the last 2 years, he co-edited with Peter Coleman a volume on psychological components of sustainable peace, contributed to a book about his intellectual legacy. That wasn't his idea, that was his student's idea. And is co-editing the 3rd edition of the Handbook of Conflict Resolution with Drs. Coleman and Marcus. He just reviewed a first draft of my chapter, so I know firsthand about his laser-like intellect and discerning critical judgment. I have more work to do. So the tips that I'm going to share in a moment now about how to achieve, because a second walk away for you today, I hope, is just to tuck away what the tips for achieving constructive conflict resolution are. And this is a subset of them. And these were developed and described in, or at least described in a book by Peter Coleman, the book on sustainable peace that we published last year. So first of all, choose cooperation whenever possible. Decades of research by Deutsch and his student David Johnson has shown the benefits of cooperation, particularly in the classroom, but elsewhere. Cooperative learning leads to pro-social development, better classroom climate, and even intellectual gains, better comprehension, and more creative solutions. But this is just an example. It's true with adults, in organizations as well. Cooperation fundamentally leads to the greater exchange of information and knowledge. And this is useful in the second tip, which is to separate the people from the problem. It's a key shift in mindset. We teach it in our classes. It requires awareness, skill, and practice. We can know it, but we have to practice doing it. In the same way that your tennis game gets rusty if you don't practice. I'm looking at a colleague who I know has a mean tennis game. If you don't practice frequently, you may still know the moves, but you're not going to be as productive on the court. I like to use the following imagery about how to be hard on the problem and soft on the people. Imagine yourself and a person with whom you're in conflict currently. It could be a family member, it could be a coworker, and you're both sitting at a table. Now, you may think of yourselves initially, and just do this little mental experiment for me, as sitting across from this person at the table. How many of you were thinking that you'd be sitting across from them? Anybody? Okay, I got to see a few hands. I'm going to ask you, instead of sitting across, to imagine yourself sitting next to them. In that way, you are partners and colleagues in trying to resolve a problem rather than antagonists who see the problem as one another. Listen carefully. What is at stake here? Listening, and this is important, listening does not mean agreement or acceptance. Listening allows you to determine where the conflict truly lies, to set aside some of your pre-assumptions, which we all have. It's the way the human cognitive system works. We have stereotypes, we have assumptions, couldn't function without them. However, when it comes to resolving a conflict, they are not useful. And so listening allows you to determine what the other party's needs are. Surprisingly, while you may imagine your needs are incompatible, sometimes you find that they're complementary. In my work as a civil mediator, I do civil mediation in the court system in New Jersey. I remember one case when that I was discouraged. I knew the case was not going to resolve. There was just too much animosity in the room. And it was a case that seemed to be rotating around the issue of money. It was an employment dispute, wrongful termination. But it emerged in the mediation that what was really of interest to the plaintiff was the fact that he had been, after 4 years of a close relationship with a man he considered his mentor, fired via email. Now, while on disability leave for emotional distress, while the money, the damages were important to him, what was fundamental was he wanted an apology. He wanted to regain that feeling of respect that he felt he'd lost. And this was my addition, the resolution also included rewriting the employee handbook for that firm so that the guidelines around termination would exclude email, texting, tweeting, whatever. Important for our discussion, culture matters. It's true that much of the scholarly work on constructive conflict resolution has been done in the US and other Western or Northern countries, Canada, the Netherlands, Australia. And this is changing, fortunately, and the work on culture and conflict, multicultural teams, oh boy, and the differences between individualistic and collectivist cultures are burgeoning. An interesting body of work is Hammer's intercultural conflict style model and inventory. Understanding the normative conflict styles of different cultural groups can be very helpful in promoting successful resolution. For example, the predominant resolution style in the US is discussion style. That is, we place a lot of emphasis, we privilege the words that are spoken. And we value minimizing our emotional expression. We want to be calm, cool, and collected. This is a generalization, but I think it holds true. Southern European, Mediterranean cultures, and also African American culture tends to emphasize or value the display of emotion in addition to the words, because it's seen as a sign of commitment. If you're not worked up about this, you're not really with me. You're not talking to me. So you can imagine how conflict style based in cultural norms can affect the challenges of constructive conflict resolution. And I'm about to wrap up, so I'll mention one other point and then highlight what I might have talked about if I had a little bit more time, and maybe we can touch on it in the Q&A period. We have a wonderful program at Teachers College, the Summer Principals Academy, where teachers usually working in urban districts come in order to learn how to be principals. And we teach a conflict resolution course. And one of the issues that we focus on, they take Hammer's instrument, so they learn which of the 4 conflict resolution styles they utilize or privilege. And many students become aware that because they have the discussion style and that American classrooms privilege rationality, calmness, raising your hand, that many urban children in their classes come from communities and families where emotion and engagement is the way you express yourself. So you can imagine that that adds to the dynamics in the classroom. What I won't be exploring further, but I want to leave you with, is again referring back to Deutsch, and that is the role of community in both avoiding destructive conflict through teaching the skills of constructive conflict resolution and ameliorating the destructive effects of conflict by providing a safe haven and a place for support and learning. And I'll leave you with this slide. It refers to a community not far from here in Miles. It's 20 blocks north of Teachers College, exactly, on the corner of 140th and Riverside. It's a community of formerly incarcerated individuals who are living in housing provided by the Fortune Academy, which provides wraparound services to support formerly incarcerated individuals in their successful reentry to society. And we've been working with them the last couple of years in a participatory action research project to understand how the philosophy, practices, and policies of this academy impacts on the success of folks when they leave. And the point about community are 2. One is the community that's created at that supportive housing facility to allow people who come from cultures of violence to learn skills of nonviolence. And believe me, they do. And the second is the community that we've formed between Teachers College and this community-based organization and its clients, in which we've learned invaluable lessons of their experience-based learning and shared some of what we know about conducting research and also evidence-based knowledge about constructive conflict resolution. So
I'd like to begin with this very simple bit of common sense that bad things happen because we sometimes forget when we study these events that they happen all the time, everywhere, as poignant as they are. So we know that during the course of a normal life, most people, in fact, everybody must confront the death of loved ones. As we get older, it becomes more and more a part of our life. It's just simply life. We also know that most of us are exposed to at least one and often many violent or life-threatening events, the kind of things that we consider traumatic events. In fact, when we have better data, it seems like these things are common in everybody's life with quite a bit of frequency. We did a study of the Columbia undergraduates. We followed a cohort for 4 years, and they went online every week and indicated what events happened to them. And some of those events were potentially traumatic events. The average number of potentially traumatic events in 4 years was 6. And that's a little bit hard to believe, but it's a fact that these events do happen, and we actually survive them quite well. Okay, so hopefully you'll understand that point, or you'll perhaps agree with that point when I'm finished. These events can be deeply distressing and sometimes debilitating. I have my own sets of nasty photos. If we go online, if we pick up a newspaper, we read a newspaper online, any day we can see these images. Because they're so poignant, because they can be distressing and disturbing, that has really colored the way, that fact has colored the way we understand them. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to understand when people are harmed by these events. And in the mental health world and the psychological world, we aim on at treating those problems. But we also need to go beyond that if we want to understand these events. The two dominant ways we've tried to understand these events in the social sciences and psychology, psychiatry, has been to focus on extremes. That's probably the most dominant perspective, which is to focus on psychopathology. We know that chronic grief and depression happens. We know that post-traumatic stress disorder happens after these events. The other way we've tried to understand these events is to focus on the average impact, how one event is different than another, how people are exposed to the event are different than another. So you hear about an earthquake in Italy, you hear about a tsunami, you hear about the types of mental health issues and problems people have relative to those not exposed. Both of these approaches tell us a lot, but they don't tell us everything, and they have serious limitations. This is a way I like to look at this. This is PTE, or potentially traumatic event. This is a continuum of time. And this is a continuum of functioning, or in this case, disruptions in functioning. You can think of this as symptoms or psychopathology, something like that. Chronic psychopathology, like post-traumatic stress disorder, looks something like that. It waxes and wanes over time, but it stays high. There's severe disruptions in functioning. This tells us a lot. We've learned a lot. We know what kinds of events cause these kinds of psychopathology. But if we know only this, we don't know about the event itself. We don't know about everybody else, because everybody else, the majority of people who don't develop psychopathology, are in this category of non-psychopathology. It's not very informative. If we think about this in terms of where people are on this graph, we just don't know. And until recently, we haven't known. So what's going on for everybody else? They're just in that broad category. So we don't really understand psychopathology if we don't understand what's going on for everybody else. One way people have tried to get at this is to look at average disruptions, average responses to the event. And it typically looks something like this: moderate to severe disruptions in functioning that endure for a while and then return to baseline. And you can talk about how long it takes. How long did people in New York, on average, the population of New York, how long did it take the population of New York to return to baseline after 9/11? These are the kind of things that you'll see. This doesn't tell us enough either, because the average actually doesn't tell us about the distribution. Most of us are not able to think in terms of standard deviations and such. Standard deviations and such, spread of distribution doesn't actually really apply if you've got a shifting mean over time and you've got something that's non-static and non-normal. So these kinds of approaches are uninformed about the underlying distribution. They're actually potentially misleading, because for many reasons, but the average is often mistaken for the mode. That's a statistical term, a very simple statistical term, but it's an interesting statistical term, and I'll show you what I mean by that. This is my daughter's 4th grade class when she was in 4th grade. I should preface this by saying I do not have permission to show this picture. This is a teacher. This is what you get when you Google teacher, is what you get that. If we take their height, this is not such a problem, because in 4th grade there isn't so much variability in height. So the height average is okay. It's sort of informative. We know that the teacher is taller, so she's an outlier, but we know that there's not a problem. Say this is a New York public school system, so they do interesting things. So the Knicks come to class someday to do a workshop on how to lose with dignity. Or in this year, it'll be how to blow it in the end with dignity, I think. So if we take the height now of the class, so the Knicks are obviously basketball players, are tall. So we take the height of the class, and now the teacher is now the average height. Now this is a silly example, but this is actually the kind of distributions that we have after violent and life-threatening events happen. When things happen in the real world, this is more like what it looks like. So the average is not really very informative. Then we come upon this situation where we have people down here, and we think, well, who's down here? And in the past, until recently, actually, we've assumed not many people would be down there on the graph, and this down here being minimal impact of an event. The average we've assumed is where most people are. Pathological end, we assume, well, that's really bad, and there must be a lot of people there because these events are really bad. So there are not likely to be many people down at this point in the graph. And that's been the common assumption for a long time. The assumption has been those people that are down there, and again, down there meaning people who are relatively unimpacted psychologically in any enduring way, unharmed, let's say, from a highly aversive event. That those people are either exceptionally healthy, they're kind of super copers, or there's something wrong with them. And there's been these are very real assumptions in the literature. So we see somebody who's been assaulted, somebody who's been in combat, somebody who's in a refugee camp, somebody who's been in a natural disaster or confronted with some other kind of adversity, and they're looking okay. So is something wrong with those people, or are they exceptionally healthy? That's been really essentially the choice in the literature, and neither of those are really very accurate. So about not long ago, actually, this is a chart of the use of the words related to resilience in the social science literatures in the title. And you can see that the word really didn't appear even into the 90s. It wasn't around till 2000 that the word began to appear. And now it's kind of skyrocketed because we've kind of said, oh, those people are actually resilient, those people that are coping really well. So about 20 years ago, we began to try to study this phenomenon by mapping people over time. And this is what we found. This is kind of a summary of what we found over the years, and we continue to find. We do see people who are harmed. There are always people who are harmed. We can't make that go away. I don't think we're likely to be able to make that go away because we're wired to have a stress response system. We have a very good stress response system, but it's not always going to be able to pull us through. So we see chronic difficulties somewhere between 5 and 30%. The 30% is the ceiling. It's usually around 5 to 10%. Sometimes people show this pattern we call recovery. It looks like the average, but it's actually not very common. Sometimes people struggle and they get a little bit worse over time. But the pattern down here, which we're calling resilience, as you can see, is between 1/3 and 2/3 of the people we've looked at tend to show this pattern. It's typically around half. And in statistical terms, it's the modal response. It's the most common response. This is pretty much always what we see. This slide, and I'm rifling through these things because I want to give you time to talk, and I think this is pretty straightforward. These are a lot of the different studies we've done. We've looked at all kinds of nasty things. If it's nasty, we're interested in it, essentially. And you can see mass shooting, traumatic injury, SARS, biodisaster, et cetera. And these are the percentages. And you can see the resilience trajectory is always the most common, and typically it's the majority. And they're always chronic dysfunctions, and the other patterns are in between. Now, if I look at data that have come from non-Western countries, what we interestingly see, there isn't that much evidence yet. Trauma researchers have not ventured out too far yet. Lena will tell you, she'll tell you about some of the stuff that is work going on and the work she's involved in that's extremely interesting in that regard. But you can see here that these are non-Western countries, Mexico and China, where these data come from. And there's some variation, but they're within the range of what we see in Western countries. And I think trauma and resilience, the frequency, those responses, those are fairly universal across cultures. What's not universal, what's variable, and that's what's really interesting, and I think what we need to find out about, is what predicts those patterns. And if we think about predicting these patterns, let's say think about predicting resilience. Before we even look at any kind of data, well, we can do some common sense reasoning. If it's 1/3 to 2/3 of a population, and these are population data, so 1/3 to 2/3 means 1/3 to 2/3 of everybody. Let's say half, for the sake of clarity, for heuristic purposes, half of a population are likely to be resilient in a disaster or a pretty nasty event. If we take half of a population, even in the most homogenized context, this is a homogenized context. You're all here for purposes, you're all highly educated. which is scary, actually, when you think about it. But you're all here for sort of a similar reason, so you're more homogenous than most, but you're still going to have heterogeneity in who you are. Different life stories, different demographic characteristics, different levels of stress, different levels of social support, different kinds of resources. There's still going to be variability. And what we find is that among these groups, large groups that are resilient, there's tremendous variability. And that means there are likely different routes to the same end. There are multiple and sometimes unexpected pathways to resilience. That resilience is not informed by one or two things. People are resilient for all kinds of different reasons, and they have different combinations of strengths and weaknesses. That's the same slide. I don't know how that happened. This is a slide that shows some of the predictors that we've been able to identify in a multivariate analysis. And what multivariate analysis means is that we're controlling for the overlap. So to give you an example of how that works, race tends to be correlated with trauma symptoms, but in a multivariate analysis, it doesn't do anything because it's confounded with all kinds of other things. So race is actually not a very interesting predictor, but socioeconomic status is, all kinds of other things are. So this gives you a sense of how variable the predictors are. Is that 12 minutes or? Okay, so this is harder than I thought. Okay. This is a quick slide of individualism, collectivism, and emotional expressivity. And individual collectivism is a nice way to think about other countries. It's a broad brushstroke. The US, of course, is the most individualistic focused country in the universe, probably, but it's certainly on this planet. And the Asian cultures, Southeast Asian cultures, tend to be more collectivist focused. If we look at individualism, collectivism, in terms of value of emotional expressivity, you see a nice correlation. So emotional expressivity is much more important. Emotion in general is much more important in individualistic cultures. So if we think about the things that predict how well people function, we're going to see variability in how important these kind of things are. I'm going to close with just one really quick slide. We did a study in China a number of years back. And China and the US at that time were on polar opposites for individualism and collectivism. And we looked at continued relationship with the deceased spouse, the sense of a continued connection with the person that you lost. In the US, this almost always predicts a worse outcome, having this sense of I'm still connected to the person somewhere. And we get a little bit freaked out by that in the West. You're talking to dead people. You're not supposed to be doing that. And it predicts a worse outcome. In China, it predicts a much better outcome. And that's partially because it's culturally part of how things work in China. So those are the kind of variables. That just gives you a little bit of a sense of how we can begin to understand the fact that people are different in different ways, and in different cultures they're going to be different. They'll be resilient for very different reasons. I put that. This was a great slide, which I won't tell you about. And I'll just okay.
So I'll start by summarizing what my colleague said so far, at least the narrative that I saw. So Claudia Cohen talked to us about how conflict resolution skills stop on its track one of the most powerful determinants, social determinants of distress and adversity. And this is intractable conflict and wars among individuals, communities, and nations. So in that sense, I see it as a prevention to exposure to adversity. Now, George Bonanno's very elegant research program has been informing the scientific community over the years and reminding us that even once exposed to adversity, in their majority, the individuals will eventually adjust over time. So my work is about those who cannot adjust. I focus on developing and testing psychotherapeutic strategies to assist distressed individuals who live in resource-poor areas, under-resourced systems around the world, like Sub-Saharan Africa and India and Haiti now. This is the bread and butter of this field called global mental health. Many people ask me, especially students, how on earth did I get involved in this field? And I want to tell you a little bit about this. It started 10 years ago And it was a collaboration among two academic institutions and a humanitarian NGO, non-government organization. So Johns Hopkins, Columbia, the New York State Psych Institute, and the World Vision Uganda. Do you see Uganda, south of Sudan? Do you see this greenish thing there? It's Lake Victoria. So it was in the south part of Uganda around Lake Victoria. That was the site of the study. These communities, because they're commuter towns, they're ravaged by the epidemic, the HIV epidemic, that hit very hard those areas. So I was doing consultation there. I was running this psychotherapy research core at Columbia. And I got this request from Johns Hopkins, this team by Paul Bolton. They told me they found very high rates of current depression, 21% point prevalence of depression. This is unheard of in these southern districts, the Massachusetts districts. And he asked my opinion how to help treat depression and use an evidence-based treatment that could be adapted for the region. And not only that, but conduct a randomized controlled trial to test its efficacy. And here's what I was thinking. Why medicalize human suffering? Why label this human suffering? Why do we call it depression? Since people went through unspeakable things. Who are we to intervene? You know, is this a colonization here? What do communities do organically to help their people, you know, move on? Should we be treating extreme poverty and war instead of doing psychotherapy? Psychotherapy a luxury? And even if it's not, should we be using our packages, you know, IPT and CBT and all these acronyms that were formulated in Western societies? And can we really do a rigorous clinical trial to test this? Is it even possible? Even if we could answer all that, is it sustainable, which is the biggest problem in this, biggest source of complaint in these communities? When we fold and when we write our papers, what will remain in those communities? So I'm going to discuss with you what I learned from this work over 10 years. We start usually by an ethnographic assessment. We want to understand context and also the local idioms of distress, how the unhappiness is expressed, what do people, where do they seek help and how? So for example, that team, when they asked through the rapid ethnographic assessment, what the impact of this HIV epidemic, of the AIDS epidemic, a lot of people said, you know, one of the worst things that happened is Okechawa and Okekubagiza, self-loathing and self-pity. And they described, the key informants described the symptoms, you know. These two syndromes were frequently comorbid. The clinicians among you know and can see that many of these, you know, behaviors and symptoms are like, you recognize it, right? It's like depression, the way we define it. And there's some culturally, you know, specific ones, unappreciative of assistance, hating the world, bad, reckless behavior, right? Not responding when greeted and withdrawn. So these not only, you know, were quite widespread, but they impaired the way people function, the way people took care of themselves and their families and their communities. So, you know, we measured, the Bolton team measured that by deriving this gender-specific task, this list they had, and you can see this here. It had to be gender-specific. Some of these tasks, you can tell, are common, but many are not. And then this was our Likert type scale we have because there is literacy is low in those societies to really depict the burden on carrying out those tasks. So by then I knew that depression is not something that we found out from our Western instruments and scales, but something that the communities there recognize as a major source of distress that need to be addressed. My question, what are they doing to address it? The local healers there felt, the traditional healers felt that they could not address it, and actually they sanctioned the project. It was our local IRB. When we're discussing the attitudes between, to really understand, since they wanted, evidence-based therapies, CBT, IBT, I was told that Ugandan people, see themselves as part of a family or group, which is, there was a proverb, people are people within people, that I always like to think. And we ran the various options by the local experts, and they felt that interpersonal psychotherapy made more sense, that more cognitive therapy that implies, this, monitoring your own behavior and the way you think. Like thinking and focusing on relationships would make much more sense to them. These were our leaders. So we had a surprise there. We thought that our providers would be the regular World Vision providers who had some, involvement in mental health or health, some occupational therapists, some social workers. When we went there, they said, we cannot spare them. We need them, but don't worry, because we hired their little brothers and sisters. So whoever hired them did a great job. We were able to train 9 out of 10, and 4 of them are excellent. We had to adapt the manual, and I recognize many of the things you, Claudia, said. We set in motion an iterative process, a very experiential process that lasted for 10 days. And the trainees were from the community, so they were a source of information. And we knew also from the ethnographic study, we had to modify, of course, those strategies. We had to simplify the strategies, give more structure. When we asked our open-ended question, we explored, what made sense. We found evidence for 3 out of the 4 IPT problem areas, which were depression happens in response to losing a loved one, having disputes, and life changes. They couldn't recognize, the 4th one, which is isolation. We had to understand how interpersonal messages were transmitted, like women would cook bad food to show that they are angry, which many friends of mine remind me happens in the West as well. We had to modify, a lot of our strategies. And then this was a picture of our counselors. I'm not going to go into details about how we tested it. It was a randomized controlled trial. We published it in JAMA. We found great effects for the scores, for the symptom scores. They used the Hopkins symptom checklist that they validated against the local idioms of distress. And also in functioning, not just at termination, but half a year after the trial. My student, Eric Lewandowski, actually, for his dissertation, we got a grant, and he went to do an ethnographic assessment to understand the consequences, intended and unintended, positive and negative, of this program that continued, after we left. World Vision hired the leaders and continued for years. So that's Eric doing his training in interviewer. So take a look at this. When he asked the key informants, the most frequently endorsed answer, and the top answers actually, didn't really deal with communication or how we feel, but it was about, our kids the kids of the people who had IPT got more education. And when prompted, they said, well, it's because they had more hope about the future. And also the parents had more hope, and the parents had more energy. We continued this work, in Haiti, and in India, in primary care systems. So we learned a number of things. We now have feasible and inexpensive, culturally acceptable, effective tools to do this work. George and I actually have developed this global mental health and trauma concentration in the master's degree, trying to train the next generation of researchers in studying this. And I want to underscore a point that both of you, I know, made several times. When we say global, we don't necessarily mean international. This is not a picture from a developing country, although it seems like it. This is actually in LA, in this stadium. These are uninsured people going there to seek medical services that were provided free. 1,500 people got all the spots by 4 o'clock in the morning. So, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
These are some of the factors that have emerged, and each one of these independently contributes. And what's really important to understand is they all contribute. This is the slide you're referring to? Yes. Yeah, they each contribute a small bit to the puzzle, like a slice of pie. If you think of this as a pie for dieters or something, where everyone's getting a little sliver of cheesecake or something like that. And personality is the one, there's some things that we love and we think about, like personality. They're resilient people, resilient types. But in fact, and it's real, the data show that there are personality types of people that tend to be more resilient, but it's only a small slice of the pie, so it's one of many factors. There are lots of things, and I think Lena mentioned this, there are lots of things, resources, that there are lots of different kinds of resources that are very important, and those are expensive things to provide people, right? Their genetics play a role, a very small role. All of these play a small role. So that's really the story.
What I was sort of privileging here is the style that gets you to constructive resolution that would involve listening, looking for options that would meet both of your needs. Sometimes the appropriate strategy, and one of the things that's important to keep in mind is there are several different strategies for resolving conflict, ranging from competition to compromise to collaboration to avoidance. Sometimes you don't want to resolve that conflict. You just want to walk the other way down the hallway and never talk to that colleague again, right? So sometimes competing, that is making sure that your needs are met, is appropriate. However, it's still the case that the more you listen to the other person and still think, is there a way I can get my needs met, taking their needs into account, you're going to be more successful. So it's a mental shift that says, once we get riled up in the affective, the emotional engagement, which we didn't have time to talk about, then you're going to be less skillful and walk away more bruised. So that's a short answer to a big, important question.
So, remember the map of, in the northern part of Uganda, we 3 years after we finished this trial, we started another one, focusing on adolescents from 13 to 17 in IDP camps, in internally displaced persons camps, because there is a huge civil war there, has been going for 20-something years. One of the worst complex humanitarian emergencies. And many of our kids in this trial were children soldiers, like 41% of the kids. So we adapted it. We have found different idioms of distress than in southern Uganda. Actually, we found this typical mixture of conduct problems and PTSD and depression that you see in kids when they're traumatized. We did this work. We adapted. Many of the caregivers, were not the parents, but many kids had caregivers. And it took them a little longer to start trusting, the group. But we showed actually significant results, and this was a 3-arm trial. So we compared IPT to waitlist to the intervention that NGOs typically do in these areas, which is creative play, which is a wonderful intervention. We found out, to our surprise, that IPT was significantly better than control group and creative play. Creative play did not differentiate from the control group. So, yes, we have done that with adolescents. I think it's time to go. Thank you so much for joining us. We are available for questions.